folks, welcome back. We have quite a bit to cover today on this episode where we discuss what the hell happened to the Detroit Lions in the second half of that NFC Championship game. We're gonna start with Dan Campbell's struggles with situational football and why I think he's still not in the great coaches category. We're gonna follow that up by addressing Jared Goff's critics and answer the question if Brock Purdy, after last night's game, is still a game manager. And lastly, my preliminary thoughts about how Kansas City and the Niners match up and what I think the Niners need to do in order to give themselves a chance against Patrick Mahomes. Before we hop into it, would appreciate a subscribe, a like. As you know, any support that you give to the channel just helps boost up the video and the algorithm so we can get a conversation going about what is real in the NFL outside of the standard talking points. There are two things that I said going into these playoffs that are really gonna matter. The first thing that we saw in the Ravens game against Kansas City is what happens when there is a lack of experience and being there before. The teams that have playoff pedigree, they are likely going to be able to comfortably go throughout the playoffs, which is what we saw with Kansas City. Now, the second thing I talked about was what I'm calling contextualization, right? Others call it situational football. But in this case, with Dan Campbell, there is a lack of understanding of when is the right context to go for it and when is the right time to not go broke taking a profit. And listen, I love Dan Campbell's aggressiveness. I think there's a time and there's a place for doubling and tripling down on going for it. But ultimately, when the stakes are this high and you're going against a team that has a very, very prolific offense, the offense that is actually the standard of the league now in the Shanahan tree, you've got to be able to understand and contextualize what is happening in the second half versus what happened in the first half. And what I mean by that is you start to see the Niners picking up an incredible amount of steam, and you start to see that they are getting fully back into what we've seen them dominate in all year long. Why Dan Campbell doesn't take the field goal and take the points in that is a complete and utter mystery to me. I get it. I understand. We have lauded Dan Campbell for his aggressiveness, his pride, and the exciting approach to the NFL coaching position. But what he's got to learn is that taking the points and not going for it on every fourth down does not make you weak, and it does not make you a failure. What it will do in last night's case was make you a winner. When you look back and you see how he continued to double and triple down in the Dallas game, right? Going for it. When taking a field goal would have been fine. Why he doesn't learn from that and understand that this game is much different, right? This is a game where you have no other choice but to lead your team to a victory and make the smartest decision and remove yourself from it. I get it. He's an aggressive guy. He's a prideful guy. I understand. You've done this throughout the season. This is what's got you there. And I also understand the thought of, well, it's gotten us here this long. Why in the world would I stop what we've been successful at? I get that argument. However, you would go up 2 scores there. Instead of that, there's this huge swing to now you're down 2 scores and have to rely on an onside kick later in the game in order to win. The probabilities are just simply not there. And so this is where I'm seeing that Dan Campbell, he's just still not that great coach yet, right? He's just not elite, because you have to be able to, if you're going to make these type of situational mistakes like Andy Reid has for the longest time, right before they won Super Bowls, or even just specifically Andy Reid before he won Super Bowls, that was always the criticism for him, right? But he always would make up for it in his superior play calling. And so with Dan Campbell, it's like, what else besides kind of rallying the team is he bringing to the organization, right, to make up for that kind of what I think is somewhat of a bonehead mistake? And I get it. I get the feeling of, it's my team. I want to do it my way when I get my opportunity. But I think ultimately he's probably going to be kicking himself this morning when he goes back through it. I think ultimately for the Detroit Lions, there's absolutely no reason for them to hang their head. They are by far much more than just a good story. They are incredible in the personnel department, and they clearly have a leader to rally a franchise in Dan. Now, I also want to quickly address the Jared Goff critics. Jared Goff has played exceptional this year. Yes, there was some up and downs throughout the later half of the season, in the regular season, but it is time for them to hush. He has taken multiple teams to NFC championships in the Detroit Lions, who have been the most embarrassing franchise in the NFL in the last half century. He's a multi-win playoff quarterback who looks like an absolute pro and leader. He's poised, and the dudes around him clearly believe in him and clearly follow his lead. And last night, he was completely Dyson. He was completely throwing the ball very comfortably. I've not been one of those people to say, oh, Jared Goff is top 10 quarterback. But I think this season, he's quieted a lot of folks, and justifiably so. Now let's hop into Brock Purdy and how I see the matchup against Kansas City playing out. Sorry to break your heart, Brock Purdy is still a game manager. Yes, he had a second half resurgence using his legs when folks least expected it. It's clear that he doesn't get rattled, he doesn't panic, and he had the composure of a 10-year vet. It makes sense why John Lynch earlier in the season said, regardless of what it took to get here, Brock Purdy is our guy, and he absolutely showed why last night. So you got to give him credit there. But here's the difference between a playmaker versus a game manager. Playmakers make plays all game long. They keep the defense on their toes, and they don't just sit back in the pocket and distribute behind one of the better offensive lines in the entire league. They move out of trouble, and they consistently use their legs throughout the season and throughout the game. Brock manages when he's going to do that. That is not a consistent part of his game, and he does those things in small doses. You can trust that he is going to make the right decision at the right time, which is textbook game managing. And ultimately, there's no doubt that this guy has the QB gene. There are some guys in this league who it looks so difficult for them at the quarterback position. That is not what's happening with Brock Purdy, but Brock Purdy is not going to go out and single-handedly win you a game like a Josh Allen, like a Lamar Jackson in the regular season, or like a Patrick Mahomes. Think about the contrast in their games, right? You see Josh Allen, you have no idea what you're gonna get play to play. Same thing with Lamar, same thing with Burrow, Mahomes, the list goes on, and that is the difference. You can compare Brock Purdy to Tua, right? Tua's going to sit there basically like a statue on timing, and he's going to release the ball. That's it. He's not going to understand the right time to use his legs, and that's where you have to give Brock Purdy his credit for last night, because I do believe he stepped up, but you're not going to get that on a consistent basis, and so that's why I don't necessarily think that he's moved out of that game manager role, and I also don't think him getting and winning a Super Bowl is going to change that. We know what Brock Purdy is, and he's clearly the right guy for San Francisco. Listen, I loved what the Niners did, coming back, never panicking, and they very well might need to come back against KC in the Super Bowl. And for them to score 27 unanswered points going into the final drives in the fourth quarter, that's some pretty impressive stuff, and that's why I think we're going to get a good game. I love the way that their rushing attack, their defense really is, that is the weakness of the Chiefs defense. I do expect Spagnuolo to throw some very advanced looks at Brock Purdy, who's still pretty inexperienced in the NFL. But we know, of course, Shanahan will likely have him very prepared for that. And I do expect them to make some really great in-game adjustments like they did last night. And the difference between the Niners and the Ravens is that they are not going to abandon the run. They understand their big play ability and propensity to just break one off eventually for 40 or 50 yards. Now, obviously, the defensive line getting to Mahomes will be the story of the game as far as I'm concerned, because if they don't get that pressure from the inside of the line to him, and you don't bring him down, he's just gonna sit there and cook all game long in the same way that he did against the Ravens. Yesterday you looked, and I believed it was that Mahomes had somewhat like 101 consecutive snaps without having a sack. I mean, that absolutely has to change. There's a reason you went out and got Chase Young. There's a reason that you've built this defensive line to be the best in the league as far as I'm concerned. And if they have any shot, they are going to absolutely have to make Patrick Mahomes second guess how quickly he gets the ball out. It's the only way to get into his head, or really any great quarterback's head at this point in the season. And I think it's going to be a very, very interesting and exciting game. I think we still are looking at the two best teams in the league. My pick was the Ravens. I was very unapologetic about that, but it's clear that Lamar is not ready to step into that level of gameplay at this point in his career. I do think it'll make a change for him, but ultimately, we'll see how the next 2 weeks unfold, and I'll give you my Super Bowl pick later on. Appreciate you stopping by. Appreciate a subscribe and a like. I will see you next time, because we are going to be talking about the NBA. It is that time of the year, baby. See you soon.